Welcome to Have a Life Teaching, the podcast designed for educators who are dedicated to enhancing their teaching practice and creating a positive impact on their students' lives. In each episode, we'll dive deep into the world of education, exploring a wide range of topics related to curriculum, instruction, and assessment in K-12 schools. Together, we'll learn from the brightest minds in the education field. So if you're a passionate educator who's ready to take your teaching practice to the next level, join us as we explore the exciting world of education. My name is John Shimbari, signing in and saying, let's have a life teaching. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Have a Life Teaching podcast. As my audience probably knows, since most of my audience are teachers, school leaders, education agency personnel, when we talk about students and their learning, I'm sure many of us have had the experience in our own classrooms where we know that we've told students 1,000 times about something, but they still do something differently. Some of that has to do with neuroscience, the psychology, and the way that the brain learns, the way that we learn information. And so I'm really excited tonight to be bringing on an educator who has dedicated her life to the study of neuroscience, psychology, and brain-based learning. So since the majority of my audience are teachers, school leaders, and others involved in educating our youth, it's very common to have conversations with children, something like this. Why did you do X when I told you 5 times to do Y? And a lot of that comes from the way the brain learns. So I'm really excited tonight to be talking about brain-based learning, neuroscience, psychology, and how they play with each other and against one another to impact not only how our students learn, but how our adult educators learn in PD sessions as well. My next guest is Dr. Judi Newman. Dr. Newman is a researcher, PhD, studying neuroscience, psychology in Australia. And she is also the author of a book on this. And the name of the book is called Influence. We're definitely going to be talking tonight about what influence brain-based learning has on learning and why educators having or should have a better sense of what neuroscience is and how it does impact learning. So, Dr. Judi, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me, John. Looking forward to talking applied neuroscience.
It's an important topic because if we are charged, as we are as educators, instructing the next generation, we might as well be actually looking at the research that backs up what we do or to stop doing what research doesn't back up. With that in mind, before we even get into any of that, Judi, can you walk us through how neuroscience became an area of interest for you specifically as an educator? Tell us a little bit about your journey, if you will.
My journey started in schools, of course, and I guess it wasn't until I became a deputy principal and then a secondary school principal in a really large city school that the penny dropped for me that the easy stuff was the curriculum, the facilities, the resourcing, the training. The hard stuff was the people stuff. So by that stage, I had already studied a diploma of teaching, then a bachelor of education, and then a master's of learning management and leadership. And I thought, what I need is psychology. So I went back to uni when I was principal and studied pure psychology, hoping that I would find the people answers for the hard stuff. But it only raised more questions. But because I studied a Bachelor of Science psychology, it introduced the neuroscience. And I thought, this is the key. Why didn't I do this 10 years ago? So the neuroscience is a lot more tangible than psychology in that we can scan the brains, we can see what's happening in the brain, we can talk to the person as well. So use the psychology behaviour studies, combine it with what we know about education, how the brain learns best, And wow, I thought it just hooked me in. So from there, I just kept studying it and then approached a professor that was focused on neuro education, and it was very new at that time, and asked him, could I combine neuroscience, psychology, and education in a PhD? And I wanted my own research, and I really wanted to work in schools. So I had my own original material. So that's how it started. So it was all about what makes people tick. How do you get people to do things without a big stick, but keep the relationship intact? How does that relate to learning in the classroom and the relationship between teacher and student? It actually took me down two pathways when I'd finished, which was perfect for me. One was leadership influence. How do you strengthen a leader's influence and impact? Because leadership is about influence, not authority. How does the brain learn best? To study motivation and leadership, you have to study how the brain learns, because to change behavior, you need to learn something. There needs to be neuroplastic changes going on in the brain. So that's where I got to, and it's led me to here today.
And as you were talking, Judy, I kept thinking about something that I've often heard when educators talk about failed initiatives. They often will say, because they applied a technical solution to an adaptive problem. You nailed it in terms of the importance of why, particularly leaders, but also teachers working with students, need to understand the psychology of those we're trying to help and teach. With that in mind, what do you wish you had known when you started as a school leader or even as a teacher, Judy, that
Mm.
you now know? What do you wish you went into those roles already knowing about neuroscience? Because I'm sure our listeners, our new teachers, our new school leaders could benefit from your hindsight.
It's really interesting that you pointed out a really important point about the technical issues. In my book, I talk about sometimes our problems that are presented to us, we meet with, as you said, structural solutions, but they're really a cultural problem. What I wish I knew when I began, it would have been very handy as a teacher, that trust, building relationships comes first. Not only are they interrelated in that the neural connections around building trust and building that rapport are interrelated, but also sequential, meaning you have to first build trust, then build the relationships in order to get organizational personal growth. And if you don't do it in that order, things are going to come undone very quickly. You can work really hard, you can be really bright, but they just don't work if you don't build those foundations first. How I came to that conclusion was, in my research, I followed high performing secondary school principals around every day and recorded everything they said and did. And I case studied them. So when I had finished collecting my data, I asked those principals, what do you do? What do you say? What does it look like when you inspire or motivate a teacher or a team member to their best performance? And then I interviewed their staff and asked the same thing. How does your boss, or how has a boss, we'll call it boss, but a leader, a principal, a deputy principal, how does a colleague inspire the best out of you? I had all this data and it was really surprising. I was delighted that there were three things that were revealed. The first one, out of all that data, there was only one outlier that didn't fit 12 leadership behavioral attributes, so character attributes. And I found that those 12 attributes, like integrity, strength, clarity, humility, positivity, could be divided again and categorized into three categories. A study of neuroscience showed me that the first third of the attributes that the coding revealed were all about calming the brainstem to build trust. The next third were all about tapping into our social and building rapport. And the last section, the last third of those attributes were all about growth and achievement. So they tapped into our prefrontal cortex, out the front of our brain. I call it our thinking brain, our third brain. Our third brain is where all our reason, logic, empathy, and our ability to stop emotion, our short term memory, it's our thinking brain. The ingredients we need for achievement, planning, prioritizing, higher order thinking, problem solving, but it's also all the ingredients that we need to keep us out of jail. We're in control. So that fascinated me. And the second delight was that even though the schools didn't know each other that I went in, they, in research, as you would probably know, and your listeners will know, you can't reveal where you've been, you can't name the school. But when I mapped the data, the shape of the graphs were almost similar. It was like a big ink. I did pie graphs and it was a big spider graph. And it showed me that teachers everywhere knew exactly what a good principal looks, sounds, and principals did know too. Whether they were one was whether they were had nailed everything, they knew what we should be doing. That was really revealing and exciting because I had something tangible to help other principals grow, other leaders around them. I was fascinated with the questions that were revealed in people's conversations when I coded. For example, brain one, which is the survival brain. I call it the emotional brain because emotional was our first language and we seem to instinctively have an emotion with any exchange. It's about trust because brain one is hardwired to detect threat. In fact, non-consciously, it detects threat 4 to 5 times a second. So trust is important to leadership and learning, principal to teacher. The questions we ask ourselves when we meet someone in the first few seconds is, am I safe with this person? Can I trust them? What will I lose? Are they opened or closed with me? Are they going to let me in? Is this the real authentic person I'm getting? Or is it just a corporate mask? When we meet someone for the first few seconds, we judge them by their trustworthiness, their warmth, and their credibility. The warmth questions are, do I feel a warm connection of acceptance with this person? You've just got a new principal. You want to know, do I feel the warmth? Are they from my tribe? Do I feel valued and understood? Because everyone wants to be significant. They want to feel like they matter. Am I in or out? Am I on the inner circle or the outer circle with this principal in their social group? And can they unite us as a team? And the third brain, which is our thinking brain, where we judge someone by their credibility, the questions we ask ourselves is, are they competent? Can they do what they say they're going to do? Are they rational and open to learning? What will I gain from this person? Are they going to be a good mentor? Will I go backwards or forwards in what I want to achieve with this person? And the last one is, can they deliver?
Mm.
That's what I found out. And I just found that so useful for my work ahead to work alongside leaders.
Schools do it wrong in the sense that they bring in initiatives, they want teachers to change the way they're doing something, and they offer those one and done workshops. And then they're surprised why change doesn't result. If I change my practices, are you going to support me or are you going to punish me? That's one thing I know the audience members are thinking. What you have said underscores the importance of adaptive change. Yes, we have technical solutions for A, B, C, and D. Let's look at the work of Robert Marzano and the 9 highly effective
He is.
instructional strategies. So, lots of great technical solutions in there for doing things in a way where we know students learn, that there is a statistical significance for doing those things. But to your point, Judi, if people aren't prepped for that, and it is different from the way that they've done things, A, are you going to back me as my principal? And B, even, are you a threat? To your point about tribe. Maybe I like closing my door, But let's say the new principal comes in, looks at the research, shows that PLCs and collaboration really do help kids. We could talk till the cows come home to teachers about the research. The research shows PLCs work. The research shows collaboration works. But if that's not the tribe that the person is in, there's work to be done in moving them over to the new tribes and for the new principal to understand where that reticence is coming from. There are lots of ways to move the dial, but none of those ways are easy ways to get systemic change. So, what would be some low hanging fruit or easy step one things school leaders could do to build that trust? And then what would be some of the things you would recommend based on neuroscience to come after that?
Yeah, I think you're right, John. That sheep dip approach to training to change a culture doesn't work. So I get everything you said, and it's so true to Australian schools too. And the fundamental principle that applies here from neuroscience is that there will be very limited behavior or learning change without neuroplastic changes in the brain over time. So change just doesn't happen in one conversation or overnight. Your brain has to rewire. So staff need time, particularly if that new change crosses their deeply held belief systems or their habits that they've had for years. And there's a call here. Schools need a new change model. It needs to consider and be mindful of how the brain operates and show that the new change is going to be better and easier. And also to learn something different can be hard. It can be a struggle where you learning something new and you fall into the learning pit. It's hard, it's tough. When we start learning something, some of us have very limited neural networks to support that new learning. We actually have to grow them. And that may take weeks or months of practice. Your question was, what's some first steps about building trust? What comes to mind first is I think we need to move away from the old fashioned idea of learning styles and move closer to the idea of leadership attributes, character, because what you say and how you turn up as a leader is going to count.
Mm.
Integrity, as I said before, humility. People want leaders with integrity. They don't want know-it-alls. They want people open for learning. They want their leader to be approachable. They want them to be curious. They want them to use hopeful language. They want to feel significant. So they want a leader that can connect. It's more about character development. And it's not hard, not very technical even. It's about knowing your starting point because we all have starting points, don't we? Leaders aren't born, they're made. Some of us have higher starting points for different attributes, but we all have different brain maps, so we're all going to be different. So it's about being self-aware, highly self-aware, and knowing what I call them edges, so your weaknesses or gaps are, and knowing your strengths. Build on your strengths and keep developing your edges.
How would you go about developing your edges? What are some things you would recommend leaders do?
I would start with the scariest thing, and that is get some feedback. Ask somebody, what is it like to spend 5 minutes with me? And say, I want feedback, warts and all. And I just don't want to hear about the technical stuff. When I'm with someone, do they see my strengths or intent, or do they only see my fears and ego? And unpack that with them. It's scary, but if you create as a leader for your company or school a culture of feedback where feedback is a gift, it's the intent behind it. It's the why, isn't it? You want to grow other people around you. And unless you're doing that, it's going to be really hard going. But
Mm.
first, we have to teach how to give feedback and how to receive feedback. You can't just do it to people because they'll probably run and hide.
One strategy I sometimes use as an instructional coach, and I learned this from a peer, I will say, all right, what should I stop, start, and continue do? At first, if people don't trust you, they won't say what you could stop. they might not even start with what you could start doing. They'll stay in the safe zone by finding something they like that you do, which is great. But I know when I'm starting to make more progress with someone when they are open to
Mm.
telling me what I should stop. It's not easy, Judy. It's not
No,
easy. I don't like it.
because you're human. And that's our emotional brain, and our amygdala is starting to go into fight, isn't it? And flee. It is scary. And that's why we've got to be very careful about how we teach and build that culture of feedback. But without it, we'll move very slowly.
Now that we're having this conversation, it also reminds me we're talking about knowing neuroscience to help others learn to calm that brain first, then to form that relationship. And then lastly, not first, but
Mm.
lastly, helping that person getting to their thinking brain. But it makes me realize the importance of even understanding neuroscience to condition ourselves as human to be embracing of feedback, even the cool feedback, if that makes any kind of sense.
And a couple of things will help there with our leadership mindset when we're getting feedback. When people get feedback, all they hear is, I don't like you. Instead of, I'm just giving you feedback about 1% of you, the 99% of you might be fantastic. We've got to keep it in perspective. The other thing is that all feedback has merit, but it may be perception. But what if 1% of that was true, that perception? And why have they got that perception is worth knowing, isn't it? And unpacking. Unless we're modeling receiving feedback and seeking it and asking for it, other people won't do it. And this is why leaders need to have humility, because no one's going to give your feedback if it's going to be a career limiting conversation.
Exactly.
And I have to say that in my experience over 40 years in education, I have had some wonderful leaders where they've taken on feedback. I've always given it. And I can say I've asked for it too. It's sometimes unpleasant, but I have tried really hard to say warts and all because I love growing. How else can you grow if you don't know what other people see that you can't see? I have absolutely run into the situation where there's a leader in a very high position that didn't appreciate it and they can't cope with it. And it's not pleasant
Yeah.
because then it is a career limiting conversation.
Exactly. What have been some of the most exciting research findings that you have found? What is really exciting you about the research now into neuroscience and its impact on learning?
I think because our focus is teaching here or for your audience, I'd like to choose one that's fairly fundamental, and that is there's a big difference between thinking and learning. When we think, our neurons fire, but it's not until the neurons wire together that we learn, and that takes time. Let me give you an example. I was in a classroom a couple of months ago, and the teacher said, I've taught this. They could talk it back to me. We practiced it. They knew the language. They could explain the terms, but they failed the exam a month later. That's a great example of I've taught it, they should know it. But she was right. She did teach it well. They did know it that hour, but they didn't revisit it. They didn't apply it. They didn't practice it. They didn't revisit, recall, sleep, revisit, recall, sleep over time, because your brain actually needs to rewire, and it needs to wire, not just fire. I think that's my biggest fundamental learning that teachers find helpful, because at least in Australia, we don't revisit enough the essential knowledges. You can't teach everything, you shouldn't. But what are the essential knowledges and skill sets and mindsets that we want our students to leave with from K to 12? And do we revisit them?
That is awesome. I had Larry Ainsworth on the show talking about priority standards and what should they be. Again, limiting the amount of standards we're
Mm.
looking at, but going deeper to your point in those standards and doing that practice over and over again. And you better believe, Judy, I'm going to use your expression, not just fire, but wire in the social media outreach for this episode, because that is an awesome line. And I think it's true. It really speaks to why I see more school leaders impressing upon their teachers the need to go over learning intentions, success criteria, having exit tickets, allowing students more voice and choice in explaining their growth, what they've learned, what they still need to learn, because that really is rewiring the brain as they do that.
Absolutely.
So now let me throw another example out at you. This is for my own selfish reasons, Judy. I created this app, which I think is wonderful. It's an AI app. I've uploaded it with all my coaching materials. Some of my folks are using it. Some of them are just not getting it or not interested in getting it. What am I doing wrong? And what can I do better to actually get more people to see the power that tool can have on their teaching competencies?
I wonder whether you choose some front runners that just love it and that they use it and share their stories. We're often frightened of new things, even if we can see the benefits, but it's not until we use it that we also feel comfortable with it. Do a podcast, we've used Zoom, and sometimes I use Teams, and other companies use a whole a plethora of platforms. That makes me nervous because it means I've got to learn yet another one. What if I'm there 5 minutes before the meeting and it doesn't work? It's about being familiar, being comfortable. So, how can you make them safe? How can you make them feel comfortable with trying it? How do you guide them through that? Yeah, I think it comes back to safety and comfort. And
And
then they'll be hooked, won't they? Once they
no,
get it, sounds
and
wonderful.
so I'm working with a group of teachers, and I've been working with them now for a couple months. And when I first introduced the AI, not so much traction. But today, as a matter of fact, because I was working in that school, one of them used it to create a correlation document with the reading programs that they're using with the person that they're coaching. And someone else used it to create a student evidence reflection form aligned whatever the learning intention was that day. I am tickled pink because that is showing me that adaptation process is starting.
Mm,
And I praise them about doing
mm,
that. I really am excited to
mm,
see what they created. They took it in ways that I didn't necessarily know they were going to take it, which is the beauty of it. And as you were also talking about helping folks get over the fear, and again, that relates to what you were talking about, that first level brain, that emotional brain, that fear,
mm.
how educators listening to this podcast, particularly school leaders, now that we do have AI and AI does have the potential of positively changing the way we teach, we are still going to need to get people over the fear of using it. So even though you were giving me advice for my own work with I think the strategies you recommended work with anybody introducing AI or really any other initiative for that matter that's new.
It does make sense, John. And the second thing would be, how do you get their attention? Because there's so much out there. How can you show them that this is really magic? This is going to make their job easier and improve what they're doing. How do you show what you're doing?
What would you recommend, whether it's AI or something else? What are the best exemplars out there for school leaders to use to get people over their fear of whatever that fear is? So, switching gears a little bit, Judy, we've talked a lot about adult learning and neuroscience connected with adult learning. We've also talked a little bit about students and that example you gave of the teacher knowing that the students knew the information, but still failed the assessment because they didn't go back and practice. So this makes me wonder about the question, what are the commonalities when it comes to using brain-based learning research to work with fellow adults? What's similar when teachers work with children? And what's different about neuroscience and brain-based learning by age?
Okay, so the first one's easy to answer, but the second one would take a day because I do a whole day on the teenage brain, a whole day on early childhood milestones, a whole day on autism, a whole day on ADHD. The neuroscience principles can be applied to if you're a parent, if you're a teacher, if you're a principal or other leader, if you're a human being. The brain is highly context and state sensitive, meaning when we remember something, the brain not only lays down the memory of the content, it lays down the context, where you were and who you were with, and the state, what you felt like at the time. So you've got a lot going on in that memory pathway. If when you need to recall that memory, you mimic and reflect that context and state, recall will be quite fast. However, if you're taught something in group work in the classroom with music and chatter around you, and you're sitting in a soft chair, 2 months later, you have a formal exam in a big hall and it's silent, your brain's going to struggle a little bit. It'll still recall, but it's going to be looking for that context and state. The students will feel differently and it's a different context. So there was an experiment, for example. The researchers, the neuroscientists, sent divers down under 6 meters of water and asked them to memorize a list of words, then brought them back 3 months later and divided the group, the same group of divers, into half. And they sent a half onto the beach and a half in exactly the same conditions, context, 6 meters underwater. Every time they replicated that, the divers underwater did much better for their recall, because as soon as they put them on the beach, the context was different. So that's how sensitive it is. And I know teachers that secretly spray rose petals, perfume around the classroom when they're learning something. And then when they have the assessment, they go around spraying it again. I love the context thing. And it also shows with adults, say you've got an airline pilot, and pilots are taught to overlearn. You have to learn something well over 100 times in the same context if you're going to override the amygdala flight fight reaction with danger. For example, if the plane's crashing, everyone's screaming and it's an emergency, it's horrible. The pilot obviously has to try to stay calm and composed, because if they're stressed, messages simply don't get through to their prefrontal cortex, their problem-solving area. You can't have that. So to bypass that reaction, that instinctive panic, you've actually got to overlearn, even though the context is completely different. I work with the military, and they tell me that when they practice in a simulation to load their gun, they will blindfold themselves, put their feet in cold ice water, and load their gun over and over and over again so that they can do it when their brain has that instinctive stressful reaction when bullets are flying past them. There was a policeman in my group one day, and I loved his story. He was an American and now lives in Australia. He used to train police officers, and he said that they were training that day the routine when you arrest someone, what you say and what you do, and this particular scenario and role play was, what do you say and what do you do in a dangerous apprehension? So he taught, this is what you do, you get your gun out, you say this. They did that over and over again in pairs. colleagues worked together. Then when they'd finished their routine, he asked them to, they only had one gun per pair because it was practice. Obviously, they didn't have bullets in the gun. 3 inexperienced police officers that had graduated that were still unable to maintain their composure in a frightening situation, which is human. When they tried to arrest someone in that situation and got their gun out and said, "Stop, this is the police," went through their routine, at the end of that scenario, they passed their gun over to the criminal because it's what they'd practiced. Your brain doesn't just read consonant state, it clumps the information together. And those clumps are really hard to break. If you try to forget the alphabet, you can't, can you? Because your brain has clumped it.
Taking it back to a school context. So if I'm understanding correctly, you're saying that we learn information in a particular context. So if our students are learning information, let's say by dialoguing with one another, but then 2 or 3 months later, they're taking a sit down independent test where they're not talking to anyone, they still will remember, but it will be harder without that similar context. So again, remember, I'm playing devil's advocate here. So are you saying that we should just teach to the test?
No, definitely not. Absolutely not. I'm saying that we should teach in 3 different contexts because your brain doesn't like to change context. So when you teach something, make sure you interleave. It's a neuroscience term. All teachers should know what interleaving is. So you teach it in a different context and another context so that you improve their performance and problem solving and innovation.
I love that. And I hope for those listening to this episode that they do take that concept as one of the key nuggets from the show. So thank you, Judi. What have we not talked about when it comes to neuroscience that you feel our listeners, who are mostly educators, should know?
The only thing that I would like to add is that emotion is at the bottom of everything. If we're talking about motivation, learning and leadership and engagement. And what I mean by that is logic and data is sometimes not enough to change behavior. You actually have to feel and experience the change before you become part of it to rewire your brain. I think we need to remember that when we're training staff and when we're teaching students. One got 9.5 out of 10, one got 2 out of 10, was rubbish. Then they interviewed people of what they used. And despite the evidence that showed one was inferior, they still kept buying it because they were emotionally invested. That's what my mum used. That's what I've always used. So we've got to remember that emotion is always going to be part of our decision making, despite what we think, and that people don't often share their emotion with a leader or their teacher. Yes, but it will be affecting their behavior because we're emotional creatures. And there's a lot on that. If people would like to dive into that, it's a fascinating subject. And there's some very practical strategies around that in my book called Influence. Please email me. I'm happy to talk to anyone about applied neuroscience. This is all I do now. You can reach me on drjudinewman.com. I have a website, lots of free resources, and also a resource shop that you can buy books and resources for schools. And Judi is spelled Judi, so drjudi.com.
I will put links in the show notes to your website and your book so people can find it easily. This has been a very interesting conversation. It went in a lot of different directions, but that's the beauty of having a podcast. So thank you for telling me about the underwater study and how they train pilots, because I found it all fascinating. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope you come back to the show one day. Thank you for listening today. I hope you got some great tips that you can bring back into your teaching. Remember, have a life teaching without sacrificing your own. Also, don't forget to subscribe and be well.